Hello and welcome to our second lecture of the course. This week we're going to be focusing on reading comprehension and reading closely. You know, as students we have a lot to read and not a lot of time, and so it gets easy to sort of skim or go on autopilot or read the words but not really ingest what the words are saying. So we're going to hopefully remedy that and give you some strategies for closer reading with better comprehension this week. I've found in my experience teaching that students who are really good readers tend to also be good writers. So if you find that you struggle with writing, the best advice I can give you is to read more. Read more often, read a wider variety of things. I know that's not always easy to do with our limited time, but it really is the best strategy to becoming a better writer. So during this course, we will be examining different writing styles, and we'll also be looking at where to look for certain things. And, you know, sometimes we have to read all of something, it's just unavoidable. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes, especially in academic journals, like we looked at in the database during the week 1 lecture, sometimes you can get away with looking at the subheadings and thinking, okay, well, this article's not going to help me, or I only need to read this section of it. So that can be really important and time-saving. All right, we're going to begin looking at rhetoric, which is one of my absolute favorite things to teach and talk about. I taught AP English for a long time in public school before I had my kids, and the class I taught was a class about rhetoric, and it was so much fun, so I get really excited to be able to talk about it here as well. And the core of rhetoric is that writers write with a purpose. You know, no matter what it is, whether it's to persuade or if it's fiction and it's mostly to entertain, we all have a purpose for our communication. And rhetoric is the art of finding the means of persuasion and using them effectively so that we can persuade our audience in a certain direction. And there are different facets to it. So we'll just begin talking here with research, which provides credibility to the author and to the writing itself, and literary devices, which evoke thoughts and feelings in the readers. You know, something may be really credible and believable, but if it's dry and unreadable, I don't want to waste my time looking at it because it's going to put me to sleep. So the two do go hand in hand. The video linked here is a really great foundation and introduction to rhetoric. So take just, I think it's maybe 5 minutes long or so, take just a few minutes and watch it, and then we'll come back together on the next slide. As the video introduced, there are 3 devices within rhetoric that are talked about most often. And those are ethos, logos, and pathos, or pathos. It really doesn't matter how you pronounce it. So the words can be a tiny bit misleading because ethos, my high school students used to always say, oh, that's ethics, which isn't really quite correct. Ethos refers to the credibility of the writer or the speaker. So what can you as a writer, or what can the person that you're reading in class, you know, for example, we're going to read Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech later. What does he do to establish credibility with his audience? We think about things like, you know, do you have credentials? Do you have experience? Even simple things like your grammar, your punctuation, the tone, is it appropriate for your audiences, are all things that can affect your credibility. Logos is the one that's most closely related to the English word logic. So logos consists of all of the research, the facts that support your argument and make it nice and strong. And then pathos has to do with emotion. How can we emotionally tug at our audience to get them to agree with us, or if not agree with us, which is a hard thing to do in this world with all of the information we have, it may be to at least open their minds just a little bit and hear us, even if they don't ultimately agree with us. Speaking of the Martin Luther King speech that you'll read, you are going to be asked to identify examples of ethos, logos, and pathos, which we saw in the last slide, but you will also be asked to identify the exigence of the speech, the audience, and the constraints. Exigence has to do with the context of why the speech or the piece of writing has come about. What's happening in the world that brings Martin Luther King Jr. to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, making that speech. And I'm not going to tell you now because I want you to think about it when you get there. But we'll look at an example in just a second. Who's the audience of the message? And you want to think more specifically than just anyone who hears him or anyone who reads. People generally have an audience in mind and they cater their rhetoric to that audience. So try to think a little more specifically than that. The constraints are the limits on how the discourse is communicated. So if you think about, let's think about when rhetoric was first developed in ancient Greece and Rome. What were the constraints there? Well, not everyone could read and writing wasn't available to everyone. So that definitely placed a limit on an argument. You mainly had educated men hearing arguments. So think about what are the limits on the argument, which have decreased over time but still exist. All right, let's think about what we've just talked about in terms of To Kill a Mockingbird, which even if you haven't read, hopefully you know a little something about. It's a novel about a father who's a lawyer and his two kids, Jim and Scout, growing up in the South during the Civil War era. Civil War, you guys, what am I saying? The Civil Rights era. So, and that's, again, tiny, tiny nutshell. But let's think about, some of the rhetorical terms that we've just talked about in terms of this novel. Now, the first one is question the information. We should always be a little bit skeptical because people do have an agenda when they write. And there's actually some controversy surrounding this novel. Some people believe that Harper Lee didn't actually write it and that Truman Capote, a really good friend of hers, actually wrote the novel. And, even if we believe unequivocally that Harper Lee wrote it, we can always question motive. However, with a beloved novel such as this, I don't think we have to go too far to think that her intentions were pretty pure in writing it and exposing the injustice in the South during this time. Okay, let's talk about the exigence, the rhetorical situation, audience, genre. So the context we've already pretty much talked about, which is Southern America during the Civil Rights era, the tension, the injustice, the chaos that ensued during that time. The audience, again, we could say, oh, the audience is anyone who reads, and, the audience continues today. Absolutely. Why do we think Harper Lee would have written it? Who do you think she most wanted to read her work? And there are options. There's not just one answer. There rarely is. She could have been writing it, yes, to persuade racists that what they were doing was awful. However, I don't think she expected to make it too far with that group of people, because people who are that entrenched in hatred, it's very difficult to get them to change their minds. So then we can think about, okay, well, maybe people in the North who are more removed from the situation, maybe she wanted to convince them that it was a problem that needed attention, and not just in the South, that, the world as a whole has to come together to fight these things in order to stamp them out. And, it still exists today. So those are some things you can think about. And again, there's not one right answer. There seldom is. So just think about all of the possibilities there. The genre, it is fiction. However, the family that she portrayed, the circumstances that she portrayed are very realistic and could have happened probably in most small towns in the South during that time. So it's a pretty universal story. And so even though it's fiction, it really hits home with real life as well. Now, the claim or thesis, I don't want to give away too much about the story, but I'm pretty certain I can say, without giving too much away, that her thesis is that the injustice against people of color was completely wrong and ridiculous and awful. And she uses this one story in a small town to illustrate just how awful it really is. The purpose, you could see it as a call to action. You could see it as awareness. Again, more than one answer might apply. So keep that in mind as you're reading critically. Now, you may be thinking, okay, this is great, but why do I need to think about these things? Why is this important? And it really, today especially, in our world of mass information, and you can find support for any side of an argument, it really is important to be able to read critically and try to sift through what's believable and what's not, and to be a critical thinker. Because if you subscribe to one way of thinking and that's all that you're feeding yourself, you're never going to see the other side. You're only going to believe that one thing. And it really is important to see multiple sides and come to your own conclusions. And that's what this type of critical reading allows you to do. And as a college student, it also helps you to identify strengths and weaknesses in things that you have to read, because not everything you'll read is going to be valuable or worth the information that it's putting forth. Oh, cool. Can you say hi? Hi. Hi. My students. That's my son, Gavin. So I think that's all I have to say about that. All right, so that is all I have for this particular lecture, except to say, as we're looking at the references, you've probably seen this a time or two on your discussion board grades, but make sure you're citing your sources on everything that you write. Even if you're only citing the course reading, it's just good practice to constantly cite your sources. So if you lose a point or two on your discussions, look at the rubric, look at my comments, and see if that's why, because I bet you it is. I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you later.